Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is our School Partner Summit with middle schools for CUNY-I. I am Sarah Lopez Amezquita. I am CUNY-I's co-principal investigator. I am also an assistant professor, now tenured and promoted at Queens College CUNY. Today, I have the privilege and the pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker. And our keynote speaker comes by way of our project director, Daniela Alulema, who is an incredible human and is in the back of the room, and connected us with Astou, who I now will introduce. So Astou Thiane was born in Dakar, Senegal, and immigrated to the United States at the age of 7. She grew up in Harlem, New York City, and as a high school student, she learned about her immigration status and faced challenges accessing higher education due to limitations tied to this status. In 2013, she received DACA, or Deferred Action for Childhood Arrival status, which allowed her to work and independently finance her education. Driven by a passion for empowerment through education, Astou became a literacy teacher in 2015, and for the next 5 years, she focused on delivering high-quality instruction and promoting equity for immigrant students in New York City middle schools, which is very pertinent to us because we are all middle schools. In 2020, Astou transitioned to the role of assistant principal of the humanities at the Canarsie Ascent Middle School in Brooklyn, New York, and we have Brooklyn in the house. There, she supported English language arts teachers in navigating the complexities of providing support, high quality and support to students in equitable and remote instruction during the pandemic. So the height of the pandemic, and she was entering this position. By 2021, my goodness, what a career. Astou was selected as the Teach for America Capitol Hill Fellow, where she used her experiences as an undocumented and Black educator to influence equitable outcomes for marginalized communities of color in the office of U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren. Currently, she leads policy and advocacy efforts at schools, or immigrant schools, and safe and welcoming in creating safe and welcoming spaces for immigrant origin students and families. And in her free time, of which I don't know where you find it, Astou enjoys traveling, dancing, we share that, and spending time with friends and family. Please give a round of applause to our amazing keynote speaker. Astou, thank you for being here. Pass it on to you.
Oh, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Hi, everyone. So glad to be here and to just learn alongside you all. I want to first thank the CUNY-Initiative for just even this program existing and this work existing. It's really near and dear to me. And I also just want to thank them for this invitation to speak specifically on the experiences of Black immigrant students. That's something that is super important to me, not just because of my work, but also because it's my story, right? I was a Black immigrant student navigating an education in New York City. I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that Sarah mentioned that I'm from Harlem. So we are in Harlem, right? This is the campus of City College. So this is just like all the feels are happening. My elementary school is 2 blocks down the street. And so growing up, we would look up at this chapel thing in City College. And that was always the dream, right? To access a college education just because it meant so much. So I want to do three things with you all today. One, I want to share parts of my journey with you. And then I want to also help you see how schools can shape students' relationship with their identity. We're educators, but we also do much more in ways that we can't even tell, right? Sometimes that we're doing that work. And then I want to leave you with some concrete practices around how to support Black immigrant students specifically, so that they don't carry the same burdens that I did. I know that some of you all might not teach Black immigrant students, but I still think that given Sarah's point about how race is captured so imperfectly in data, right? You'll see the demographics allegedly have no Black students or students be 83% Hispanic. And that might not be the case. Some students have intersectional identities. They can be Black and other things. And so I still think it's a helpful frame to think about and use in our work. So like I said, I went to elementary school down 2 blocks down the street from here at PS 123. And so my story began in Senegal, West Africa. So I moved to the US in 2000 with my parents and my sister. None of us spoke English. And as Francophone West Africans, our silence and our accents really dictated how people treated us. I remember my mother, when she would try to advocate for herself, was met with raised voices, sighs of exasperation, interruptions, right? And people assumed that not knowing English meant that she was not intelligent. And I remember how my mom always looked really defeated after interactions at the supermarket, interactions at the post office, you name it. But I remember my second grade teacher, Miss Spain, and she was special because she never treated my mom that way. This woman was like an angel. She just was really gentle and had this empathy that she radiated. And so I really liked Miss Spain. And one day she paired me with another West African student named Sophia too. And Sophia too's job was to translate in African to me. So I'll say it again because it goes a lot of right. She was 7 with me, and her job was to translate in African to me. Africa is a place with over 2,000 languages, not dialects, whole languages and cultures. And so here's Miss Spain, right? A well-meaning educator, one that by other metrics, right, went above and beyond, but she made this mistake. And my reaction was just immense pressure. So Sophia too didn't speak my language. I spoke Wolof. I don't know what ethnic group she was, but she didn't speak my language. And so Sophia too would be talking. And for months, right, she would speak very passionately, and I did my best to act like I knew what Sophia too was saying, and pretending to understand. And I felt immense pressure to figure things out and to act like I understood because I knew that Miss Spain, I would always be in the back on the side. She was completely overwhelmed and just did not know what to do with me. And I desperately wanted to prove to her that I was smart and I didn't want her to give up on me. So this charade with Sophia too lasted months. It was until fourth grade that I was like, girl, I don't know what you be saying. She was West African, but we were not from the same culture. Um, and so by third grade, before that, I'll mention that I did receive ESL services. This is back in 2000, that's what they called it. But it was taught entirely in Spanish. And there was another woman, Miss Perez. She was really lovely. But I remember I hated ESL because it was taught in Spanish. And I was there with all the Dominican kids and the Puerto Rican kids. And they seemed to be having a time. But I just I didn't know what was happening. And it was yet another space where I had to kind of really act and like pretend like I understood. So despite all that, by third grade, I learned English. But I think the seeds of shame and confusion and pressure began around my identity and around my immigrant story began to take hold. And I carried those seeds with me well into adulthood. And so here I think what I want folks to know is that students may perform confidence or understand. And they might because they want you, the teacher that they put on the step pedestal, whether you like it or not, they want you to believe in them and they want to connect with you and they want to please you. And so don't assume comprehension. Those checks for understanding, whether you're an ENL teacher or not, are really, really crucial. Language mismatches happen, right? I don't doubt that none of you would ask a student to translate in African to another student, but I do think even the burden of asking students to translate for each other is something that is still unacceptable and gets problematic as well. And then, two, thinking through how linguistic marginalization can lead to internalized shame or othering for students, right? That's something too that kind of is traced back to this period of me being a second grader in school. Um, so by middle school, right, and at this point, I could speak English with no trace of an accent. Like if you could, I could turn the Harlem on and off. So teachers often just didn't know that I was African, right? Until they saw the name or until I shared. But in middle school, I worked really hard to blend in because my parents would say that, she has this complex, right? Which was true. I did have this complex. When my mother came to school in her bright West African clothes, I was mortified. Even when adults called her so beautiful, an African queen, and I'm sure she did it on purpose because she was like, "You have a complex, and we are beautiful, and our cultures were celebrating." She would show up all the time in her brightest clothes. Um, and all I could think about was how much worse the next day's African booty scratcher, bullying comments would be after my mom showed up, right? She really kind of messed up my like attempts to blend in and be Black American. Um, and then in middle school came Mr. Lawrence's assignment. And Mr. Lawrence was my favorite teacher in middle school. He taught social studies, Black male teacher, really, really high bar for all of us. And his assignment was to have a parent write a letter about an, the most important issue affecting the Harlem community. And that assignment caused me so much dread. My father could not read and write. When you come from a country like Senegal, where the literacy rate is about 50%, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for West African parents or even African parents, right? Or people from emerging countries to not be able to read and write, but be able to speak, and you wouldn't tell. And then my mother could read and write, but only in French. And I was terrified that Mr. Lawrence would judge us if I didn't submit it. Like for me, I had to figure out a way to do this. And so I remember writing the letter and then having my mom write it in her handwriting and submitting that in. And it was so agonizing for both of us. And even now, like after being an educator, I think about what would it have been like for me to tell this man, can we have a workaround? Or for him to not assume literacy from parents. And so that experience again was another example of kind of the shame that I felt from being an immigrant, from being coming from the background that I came from having the parents that I had. Um, and so, I want you all to think about how might well-intentioned assignments, maybe not like, oh, asking parents to write something, right? That's kind of unusual, but well-intentioned assignments, how they might unintentionally expose a student's vulnerabilities. What unspoken assumptions do we make about students' families, right? Even within our very advanced, like y'all are the cream of the crop in a lot of these spaces. You all are the teachers that all the other teachers go to and say, hey, I have this student who is an English learner or who is an immigrant. But even in your space, there are assumptions that are invisible that are operating. And so think critically about those. By the end of middle school, I got accepted into Brooklyn Technical High School. So somehow I passed the specialized high school exam here in New York City and ended up at Brooklyn Tech. And I felt proud to be there, but also I think at Brooklyn Tech. So I went from Harlem, where all my peers, we were all Black, right? And then I went to Brooklyn Tech, and it was like a different world. 5,000 students, half of whom were maybe either Chinese. First time I was around Bengali students. It was the first time I was around white students who were Russian and from Ukraine. And at Brooklyn Tech, I became just Black, right? My West African identity didn't really seem to matter anymore. People started to assume that I was Black American. Um, and I had a fitting in problem for a long time. So I was like, okay, cool, we could do this. Problem solved, right? But then I saw kind of how US racial categories and anti-Blackness began to operate. And for the first time in this space that was the first multiracial space that I had been in. Um, and that came with assumptions and microaggressions, right? I was called articulate. I was called classy and exceptional by peers and right teachers alike. And there was always like a something weird was amiss, right? They were compliments that seemed to be comparing me to something, but I wasn't really sure what all was happening. But most importantly, citizenship was assumed. And so no one talked about immigration at Brooklyn Tech. This is one of the best high schools, arguably, in the whole country. And I received a world-class education at Brooklyn Tech. But no one talked about immigrants and even acknowledged that there was a possibility that people could be undocumented at this in this setting. And so when I learned that I was undocumented, and I always say it that way, and people think it's strange, but I learned I was undocumented at 17 through the college application process because for the first time I was being told to fill out the FAFSA and you needed a social security number. And I know folks from other places like that's strange, right? Because kids, you need a driver's license and you get asked for a social security number, or maybe you try to get a summer job and you need you need a social security number. But in New York City, you don't drive. So you bypass the whole like license period. It was also like some students work, but I didn't work, right? My parents took care of me. So for the first time at 17, folks wanted a social security number. And when I went and asked my parents for it, that's when I learned that I didn't have one. So I always knew we were immigrants and I knew where I was born, but I kind of just assumed that like things were fine because they had been. And so that felt like running into a wall. Um, and so after learning that I didn't have a social security number, I think I spent that night Googling just all the implications and my mind was blown. I literally thought my life was over. And so I did what most kids do, which is they turn to educators. So the next day at lunch, I went and found the guidance counselor who kind of had the knack for finding kids scholarships. And I remember trying to whisper to this woman, like, hey, could you point me to the ones for all the kids who don't have socials? And her reaction, I'll never forget it. It's almost 15 or 17 years later, and she looked so disgusted that I had and that I would have the audacity to ask her. And she said very definitively to me, "You can't go to college," almost as if it was ridiculous that I wanted to do this. Um, and so that moment was another moment of shame and kind of just hopelessness, really, right? Um, and once again, from that interaction, I believed I had to carry it all alone. Um, and so that's what I did, right? And the consequences of that were that I literally shut down. So I continued to like apply to colleges, but they would ask for deposits and ask for proof of status, and I would abandon the application. And so randomly, I think in August, right? So from senior year till August, I remember I called Hunter College, which is a part of the CUNY system that City College is a part of. I randomly talked to another educator and said, hey, like I know it's August and classes have started, but can I still come? And she said yes. And that was only because of the CUNY system, right? And like the intricacies of the CUNY system. Tuition's $3,000 a semester. They don't bar you access because you don't have a social security number. So I really, really got lucky with another educator, but the previous one in high school kind of created this, I was really shut down and never spoke about my status again in that space. Um, and so I think the takeaway that I want you all to kind of notice from my high school story is that, you know, your Black students may also be immigrants. They can sound like, you know, I've been told I live in DC now. They're like, your accent, the New Yorker accent, so thick. And I'm just like, what are you guys talking about? They're like, the way you say coffee. And I'm like, because that's how you should say coffee. But anyway, um, you know, I sound like a New Yorker, right? I sound like every other Black American student. But didn't mean that I wasn't an immigrant and that being undocumented wasn't a possibility for me. Um, and so if no one names that possibility, if no one acknowledges that possibility, if you're standing in front of Black and brown kids and you're never even speaking or showing an awareness of that, you're also sending a message, right? And so it has a way of normalizing it when you show that you see all these perspectives. Um, and so I want to get into strategies because I know y'all are educators and, you know, give you the most out of your PD. And so I'm going to pivot into strategies now, right? And I think the first one is to be intentional about belonging. How do you create belonging in the spaces that you own and occupy? Um, so go beyond Black History Month posters, right? I was at a school that it teaches immigrant students, and they had the Black History Month posters, but I wondered, like, okay, go deeper, right? Learn the specific cultures of your students. So I really loved, here are the languages spoken in our school. So refreshing being in spaces of ENL and English learner educators who speak about languages and specific cultures, right? Rather than sweeping generalizations about, oh, they're from the Middle East, or they're from Africa. Invite students to share parts of themselves in the ways that feel empowering and not performative. Ask always, what stories are you centering in your classroom? Um, One thing that always kind of makes me feel a little invisible is when I'm in immigrant spaces or spaces for newcomers, and folks who are presenting or folks who are owning spaces switch immediately into Spanish and don't even think to provide a translation, right? Even that creates an othering. And so really think about who and what cultures you center. And that should give you information about those other cultures that you need to kind of make sure that you are also centering to. Number two is avoiding assumptions, right? Don't assume that all Black students are Black American. Blackness is a diaspora, right? African Americans are one part of the Black diaspora. There are folks from Africa, there are folks from the Caribbean, who might not speak English, whose primary language might be French, right? Or Creole or other languages. So don't make assumptions about folks just based on how they look or how they sound. Um, don't assume all immigrants speak Spanish. Um, don't assume parents are literate. Literacy is a big one in these spaces. So folks, are like, yes, I have this translated into 8 documents, and I'm like, you're doing it. What about the parents who can't read or write? How are you connecting with them? How are you making sure that they feel like there's a space for them to join the PTA or to show up to the event? And ask open and respectful questions, right? Be curious but not intrusive. So there's a fine line, right? I always, feel like I'm being overly obvious, but never ask a student if they're undocumented, right? Or a parent if they're undocumented. But be open. I think when you show visibly that you value people's cultures, that you have a diverse, that the immigrant community is diverse, kids come to you, parents come to you and disclose, but it shouldn't be the other way around. And then the third piece is just using a critical lens. So many school systems center Latinx immigrant needs, and Black immigrants fall through the cracks. And it's interesting because Black immigrants, though they're not the majority of the immigrant population in this country, are criminalized at 5 times the rate as other immigrants. They often live in over policed places like Harlem, right? And so their likelihood of interacting with the police and law enforcement is much higher than maybe other groups of immigrants. All of that is at play when you are in front of Black immigrant students, potentially, right? And so think about that. I know that, again, you are constantly bombarded by demographics showing that your students are majority Hispanic, but do not think in the binary lens, right? Intersectionality is real. And students can be both, right? I've met somebody who was Black and Chinese from Jamaica, and I was like, what? I'm like, yeah, people are Black and Chinese in Jamaica. So think about that as well. Advocate for language access beyond Spanish, right? Push for inclusive curriculums that honor African and Caribbean cultures, in addition to Black cultures, in addition to all the other cultures as well. And then look for policies and practices and think about who are they unintentionally leaving out. Maybe you're organizing a trip that's abroad, or you're organizing some, the other day I was at a school that was having like a FAFSA competition, a FAFSA completion competition. And then, right, very like, how many of y'all like, I don't see the problem with that. And it's fine. like FAFSA completion competition. And it's like a specific subset of students who are undocumented cannot complete that FAFSA because they don't have a social security number. And so they are now you're putting them in the position where they have to disclose their status. And if they're disclosing their status, they're disclosing the status of their families, right? So I really mean all practices and think about who might you be leaving out. Because this issue, I think, cuts through a lot of different layers in the school. So to bring it kind of home, I did eventually find my voice. I did eventually learn to not be ashamed of my background and to get rid of this complex that like my mom and my father would troll me about. And now I'm very proud of where I come from. I'm very proud. I'll correct somebody if they call Wolof a dialect, right? It's a language. I think I'm very outspoken about these things, but that was not easy. Costs a lot of money too through therapy. So um, I share my story though because I want educators who I know are well intentioned and well meaning to hear about these perspectives and to take that in. I don't doubt that Miss Bain and Mr. Lawrence, if they were in this type of PD, would not make some of the mistakes that they made, right? They're all well meaning. And so, as educators, you have the power to create those spaces and to also challenge your colleagues who also might be making some of these mistakes and excluding some communities. And so finally, I'll just say, this is cliche, but it's not, right? I thought I couldn't go to college because of an educator, and I went to college and then turned out to have this career because of an educator. So you have tremendous power in how you show up and what you create, what you say is possible for young people from all backgrounds. And so really step into that power and own it. I think you're here, so that means that you all kind of are in this work together. And so I'm grateful for you all being here. Um, and so that's kind of the ending point of the keynote. I want to pivot us into an activity because I know I threw a lot at you. And so we'll go into kind of part two, which is from reflection to a little bit of reflection, but also action, right? And beginning to deepen our commitment to Black immigrant students. And again, I'm aware that some of you all don't have Black students or don't teach in spaces. Well, you teach Black students, you don't think they're immigrants. That's how I always like to say it, right? Or maybe it's not coming out in the data. But I think this exercise is helpful either way. And so I want us to reflect about the keynote, engage in dialogue, and then commit to one action that we're leaving the space with. So first, I'm a big fan of processing. And I don't like PDs where I'm not given time to process and marinate and think about things. So we'll do that first and then go into a group share out and then pivot into our commitment exercise. So I'm not sure if Maria Jimena was able to get the index cards for folks. Okay, so Daniela and maybe Sarah, you can help with this. They're gonna go around and pass you each an index card. And I want you all to take 7 minutes and think of and reflect about either of the two prompts. So the first prompt is to think of a student you worked with who may hold layered identities. Maybe they're a Black immigrant, maybe they're multilingual, maybe you know for sure that they're Afro-Latinx, even though on paper they're highlighted or designated as Hispanic. Think about that student and think about what assumptions you or others may have made about them. And how do you think they might have felt at school? Or you can think about just another part of today's keynote that resonated with you most and why. So I'm kind of giving you an option, right? Think of a student if your mind goes to a student. And then, or some part of this keynote landed for you and why. Take 7 minutes to process, and then we'll come back together.